The subject I'm going to talk about today is war and international politics. And this is actually a talk I gave only once before, and it was the Richard K. Betts inaugural lecture at Columbia University this past November. I want to make it clear as I start that when I talk about war and international politics, I'm really talking about great power war. And it's important to understand that during the unipolar moment, which ran from roughly 1991 when the Soviet Union went down the toilet bowl until about 2017, we lived in a world where there was a single great power, which was the United States of America. That's why it was called the unipolar moment. And if you live in a unipolar world, you can't have great power politics because there's only one great power. So you can't have great power politics by definition. But we now live in a multipolar world. There are three great powers out there: the United States, China, and Russia. And we live effectively in a multipolar world. And that means that great power politics is back on the table. You can have security competition and you can have war among those great powers. And I think the subject of war and international politics, great power war and international politics, is a subject you want to think long and hard about. It's a lot like nuclear deterrence. When guys like Mike and I were young, we knew all about nuclear war, we knew about nuclear deterrence, we knew a ton about great power politics because we lived in a bipolar world. It was dominated by the US-Soviet competition. The world that most of you grew up in was the unipolar world. There was one great power. You weren't worried about nuclear war among the great powers. You weren't worried about great power security competition or great power war because it was largely irrelevant. That world has gone away, and we're now in a multipolar world. And it's a quite dangerous world, as you have surely figured out, and it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. But that's not my subject today. Now, the perspective I'm going to offer you on war and international politics is a realist perspective. As I'm sure everybody here knows, I'm a realist, and I'm a particular kind of realist. Mike and I have fundamental disagreements about how the world works, even though Mike is a realist. So you should understand that you're getting a particular realist perspective on the subject. Now, my talk is going to have three themes, and I'm basically addressing three issues. I want to talk first about just the essence of international politics. I want to talk a lot about the essence of politics. Two, I want to talk about the decision to go to war, when great powers decide to go to war, how they think about it. And then third, I want to talk about escalation in war. Okay, and let me just briefly tell you what the three themes are, because I'm a big believer it's very important to have a framework in your mind to begin with that you can then use to keep track of the various detailed arguments that I'm laying out. With regard to the essence of international politics, my first point, I'm arguing that war is the dominating feature of international politics. It really matters enormously. It matters in terms of influencing how leaders think, and it influences how states interact with each other, whether you're talking about an actual war or the fact that war is sitting there in the background. It is the dominating feature. And therefore, international politics, I will argue at some length, is an intensely competitive enterprise at its core. Intensely competitive enterprise at its core. So that's my first theme. My second theme, which actually runs against the conventional wisdom, is, and this is all about the decision to go to war, is that war is an extension of politics by other means. This is Clausewitz's famous argument. And it's a tool of statecraft. And it has little to do with ethics, it has little to do with morals, has little to do with international law. States go to war when they think it's in their national interest. This means, very importantly, there are two kinds of wars that are acceptable and to be expected in international politics: preventive war and wars of opportunity. That runs against the conventional wisdom, as I'll explain in great detail, in the United States of America and in the West more generally today, where those two kinds of wars, preventive wars and wars of opportunity, are ruled out of bounds according to just war theory and international law, right? And then the third theme has to do with escalation in war. And this is an argument that once you get into a war in the modern age, there's a very powerful tendency for wars to escalate to their extreme level, to their absolute level, to get total wars. Right? It's one of the main themes in Clausewitz. We don't have time to talk about this today, but if I gave you a lecture on Clausewitz, this is written all over that book. He understands that tendency to escalate. And what happens when you get in a war with that tendency to escalate is that military considerations end up dominating political considerations. Remember, with regard to my second point, I said, apropos Clausewitz, war is an extension of politics by other means. That means war, military factors, are subordinated to political considerations. But the escalation argument is that once you get into a war, once you're in it, right, the powerful tendency that exists to escalate means that political considerations get subordinated to military considerations. And my argument is this is not good under any circumstances, but it is certainly not good in the nuclear era where you want the politicians, the policymakers in charge to make sure that that war doesn't spin out of control. Okay? So those are the three basic themes that I want to develop in my talk. Okay, so let's start with the first theme, which is that war is at the core of international politics. You want to remember here, what we're talking about is the relationship between war and politics. And as we go along here, you want to just think in your mind what war, but more importantly, what politics is all about. You know, I never thought much about politics. And what if you would ask me to define politics anywhere in my life up to the time I was about 68 years old, I wouldn't have known what to tell you. What is politics? You know, how do you define politics? How do you think about politics? You want to think about politics, what it means. You want to think about international politics, and then you want to think about how war and international politics are related. Right? These are big picture issues, right? So, again, as you heard me say in my setup remarks, that war is the most important feature of international politics, and it influences how leaders think, right? It's there all the time. It's constantly influencing them, and it influences how states interact with each other, right? They're greatly influenced by this phenomenon. Now, my argument is not that we live in a constant state of war. Obviously, we don't live in a constant state of war, right? My argument is we live, again, we're talking about great powers, in a state of constant security competition. Great powers always engage in security competition. Sometimes it's more intense and sometimes it's less intense, but they always engage in security competition. And sitting in the background is the possibility of war. The United States and the Soviet Union competed constantly for security during the Cold War, and there was the ever-present danger of war sitting in the background. Furthermore, there is no question that war is an absolutely destructive and dangerous enterprise. Its horribleness is in good part what makes it so important. So I want to make it clear here, I'm not saying that this is a sport. This is like playing a football game. This is like playing the Super Bowl. This is a completely different kind of phenomenon, incredibly destructive, incredibly horrible. And furthermore, it's not only the fact that lots of damage, lots of destruction is inflicted on you in a war, or can be inflicted on you in a war, it's also the fact that the survival of the state is at risk. You never want to underestimate the importance of that dimension of the story. Survival really matters. But given how destructive war is, and given the fact that it threatens the survival of states, unsurprisingly, states have gone to great lengths over time to do away with war, to outlaw war, to figure a way to get rid of it. But you know what? They failed at every turn. They never got rid of it. And they're never going to get rid of it. It's going to be there forever. Right? So the question is, why is this the case? You want to think about this. Why haven't we been able to get rid of war? And I'm going to make two arguments. The first one, it has to do with the nature of politics. And the second is it has to do with the architecture of the system. This is the anarchic nature of international politics. So it's a two-part argument. This is why you can't get rid of war, why it's an ever-present possibility that sometimes manifests itself in actual fighting. There are two reasons. The first has to do with the nature of politics. And this is what I was imploring you to think about today and think about in the years ahead. Just what politics is all about. Politics, as Barack Obama, right, and Bill Clinton said, is a contact sport. It's a nasty business. Politics is all about fundamental disagreements on first principles, fundamental differences about questions regarding the good life. And these fundamental differences that individuals or societies or states have are sometimes so profound that people want to kill each other. Just go back to the religious wars in Europe way back when, Catholics and Protestants killing each other in huge numbers, right? Just mattered so much to them. The abortion issue, an incredibly complicated issue. There are lots of people running around in the land who believe in or don't believe in abortion, who would like to kill some people on the other side. It's a contact sport, right? These differences really matter. Look at the fights over Supreme Court appointments. Look at how all of these anti-Trump people feel about the possibility of him getting reelected. My wife, who's basically a Republican, you mentioned the possibility of Trump winning, and she gets mad at me. I said, what are you getting mad at me? I didn't vote for him last time. I'm not going to vote for him this time. She's just so infuriated at the thought of this guy getting reelected, right? And by the way, there are lots of people on the other side. You get my brothers talking about Hillary Clinton. Oh boy, right? I'm just saying, what you have to understand, the intensity and the enmity that comes with politics is not to be underestimated, which is why Clinton and Obama both said it's a contact sport. And I have a similar quote from Newt Gingrich in there, which makes the basic point. That's why to make politics work, you have to have compromises. You want to understand that there are no solutions to lots of disagreements about first principles, right? There's just no solutions. There are always these intense disagreements, and the question is, how do you deal with them? Inside a state, inside the United States of America, inside Japan, inside France, you deal with it by creating a state. And that state protects people. It allows them to disagree, but it protects person A from an attack from person B, and vice versa, right? So you have a state. But this gets to my point about the architecture. In the international system, there's no higher authority. There's no higher authority to protect these states, which sometimes have fundamental disagreements. So, what this says is you can't take war off the table. You understand? You can't take war off the table. Remember I said politics is all about the fact that you have fundamental disagreements between individuals, between societies, between groups in society, between states. You have fundamental disagreements. And those disagreements are sometimes so profound that A wants to attack B and kill it, right? You can't take war off the table because there is no higher authority. Inside the state, you can take murder off the table. You can take killing off the table in large part, certainly in those areas where the higher authority has presence. But you can't do that in international politics. And when you add to that the destructiveness of war and the fact that your very survival might be threatened, right, you can see where that leads you, right?